Get ready to enter a brave new world with your host, Vasant Dar.
Welcome to Brave New World. There's a fascinating clip on YouTube recorded in 1958 of Mike Wallace interviewing Aldous Huxley about his book Brave New World, which he'd written a quarter of a century earlier. I'm amazed at Huxley's farsightedness on a range of topics, including a world shaped by overpopulation, technological devices, and the advertising complex, which at the time was being shaped by the madmen on Madison Avenue. I'm referring to the show Mad Men, of course. The new advertising machine is big tech. Mad Men have been replaced by calculating machines that gorge on data about human activity. A large part of today's conversation is going to focus on why and how big tech dominates the digital advertising marketplace, app stores, and our life in general, and why we should care as ordinary citizens. Does it impact the prices we all pay for things? Does it encourage behavior that's bad for us, like reducing market efficiency, privacy, and our general well-being? What should we do about this? Joining me today on Brave New World is Dina Srinivasan, who's a fellow with the Thurman Arnold Project at Yale University. Her research and economic analysis of digital markets is providing the foundation for government enforcement of antitrust laws against two of the largest market cap companies in the world. I'll link her articles in the show notes, which you can find on our website, bravenewpodcast.com. Dina, welcome to Brave New World. I am delighted to have you on the show.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
So it looks like you're on the West Coast. Am I right?
I am on the West Coast, just out of San Francisco.
So how's this time been for you? But how's COVID been for you?
You know, it's been pretty locked down here in California. So I'd say that's one thing that we've had to deal with. We had just sent 2 children to college and they both came back. So we had 4 children in the house for another year. And, unfortunately on the West Coast, we're also dealing with fires. So this morning I woke up to a red sun and I was just wondering, okay, what does this mean? Is this smoke again?
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. I think it was a couple of weeks ago that New York City was blanketed by the side effects of these fires. It's amazing that they've actually spread across the country, or rather the effects have. So, Dina, just for our audience, tell us a little bit more about yourself. Anything at all, anything personal before we get started?
Well, let's see. I was raised for many years in Lebanon, which I suppose informs my thinking and doing to some important extent. Came to the U.S. for my final year of high school, studied political science, which was fascinating because my entire education had been largely science and math. Went to law school and had a bunch of children, 2 going into law school. I was pregnant with my third year, had a 4th right after that, and just didn't think I could jump into the law at that point in my life. And went the entrepreneurship route instead. And then later came back to the law in 2017.
So what were you doing in Lebanon? How come you grew up there?
My father's Lebanese. My mom's American.
Okay.
Yeah, my dad's Lebanese. And it was sort of bouncing back and forth between the U.S. and Lebanon and then just staying in Lebanon for a while.
Yeah, it's interesting. My previous guest, James Robinson, who was the author of Why Nations Fail and now The Narrow Corridor, talks about Lebanon a lot as a classic example of a failed state or a state with like some deep divisions. And it's interesting getting into sort of his theory and the reasons for that. But, we'll save that for another conversation. It's just fascinating the way he describes Lebanon and the clans and that no one really has interest in the state really working. The divisions that exist are sort of ossified and perpetuated by the state. It's sort of a little bit like also what's happening in India, according to him, where there are these, his theory that there's these caste divisions which inhibit state capacity. But that's a fascinating but different conversation. But today we're going to talk about big tech and how we got here and what should we do about it. This is front and center in news these days on Capitol Hill, and I'm sure you're sort of in the middle of it. So you probably have a great vantage point to help us understand the situation. So Tell us, how did we get here to begin with? Google's founders promised that Google would be a different kind of company. Facebook's young CEO in hoodies promised us a hands-across-the-water future where tech would unite us. What went wrong?
That's a good question, in terms of how we got here. I think probably whenever you have rapid evolution of industry in any society, it just takes time for regulators and for society at large to catch up with things, and to fully appreciate what's going on. I think that's one big thing that has probably been going on, and just catching up in terms of understanding the issues, being able to follow the language, the language of tech, and also just how do we think about antitrust law with these new economic problems. I think that's required catch up. Probably the fact that things have been free or sometimes free has also diverted attention. But I read a very good op-ed the other day in the Wall Street Journal where I learned that the cigarette companies also gave away cigarettes for free initially. And that was their primary marketing strategy. I thought that was fascinating. I'm sure I should have known this, but I didn't.
Your description of the cigarette industry reminds me of Mad Men. And there's this episode where they're trying to figure out, what's the best way to sell cigarettes? And they say toasted, not roasted, or something like that. And it's ironic that we're talking about Mad Men because that was kind of the good old days, if one wants to call it that, of advertising. Things were slow. And maybe that's a good place to start. Maybe let's just start with Google while we're talking about Mad Men and how advertising these days, how it works, how it's different from those days of Mad Men. Because I suspect that most people don't really understand how the whole digital advertising market works, the whole ecosystem. And I must admit that I don't completely understand it fully myself. I mean, I understand the financial markets very deeply because I've been immersed in them. And it took me a long time to actually come up with parallels to the financial market. But let's back up a little bit here and get into how does this whole thing work, just for the layman. So let's just establish that and then try and get at what the problems are at the moment.
So the other funny thing here is this my prior time before flipping back to legal was on Madison Avenue in that Mad Men world. I worked with the original Mad Men agency. I was working for WPP, which is one of the largest advertising agency holding companies in the world, if not the largest. And so I was in the middle of that world and looking at the evolution of digital. And I remember there was a moment in 2014. At the time, I was thinking mostly about privacy and surveillance and how this runaway industry might present issues under antitrust laws, because I just didn't think it was true that consumers were getting a great deal. And whenever you have an industry where sort of consumer preferences are going out the window, you have some sort of problem. You might have a cigarette type problem, or you have an antitrust problem. So there was a moment in 2014, I remember, when executives in the advertising industry were passing around this book by Michael Lewis called Flash Boys. And it was about sort of speed races and arbitrages that were happening in financial markets. And so somebody recommended this book to me, and I read the book. And, it's a fascinating book. It's a great book. There was regulatory explosion after the book came out. And the sentiment in advertising was, oh, isn't this funny? We do all this too. We play the same games, And so there was this fascination with reading this book because it reflected a reality in the advertising industry. And for me, when I was doing those two things, when I was sort of reading Michael Lewis's book and then sort of just observing the fascination of executives in the advertising industry, I just thought, well, this is like really interesting and a problem, because obviously from a bigger picture standpoint, it doesn't make any sense from a policy perspective to have similar markets and to have this conduct over here, which is causing a regulatory outrage, and to have the same conduct over here and there's silence. And so that's really what, it was a moment in time that I just remember, I just remember that moment in time. And when I left the industry in 2017, I decided to write about Facebook and privacy and surveillance first because while I think it's a fascinating topic and a really important issue to consumers and in democracies in general. And then I turned back to this moment in time in 2014. I decided to, pull out Flash Boys again and to start diving into the industry. And one of the fascinating things, which is true and has been true in the advertising market, and which was true actually in financial markets as well, is you have lots and lots and lots of people and businesses participating, and they just don't understand the complexities or what's really going on, right? And so this is why, for example, in financial markets, Flash Boys came out in 2014, but that conduct started in 2004. Isn't it interesting that you had a 10-year gap of basically not much going on, right? And it was the same thing in advertising. There was just a lack of understanding, and I also had this lack of understanding. So just because I worked on Madison Avenue and for the Mad Men sort of agencies, I also didn't understand the intricacies of what was really going on in the market. And so I spent about a year researching it to really fully understand what exactly was happening, what was Google doing, what are the complaints against Google and advertising markets, and so that's sort of how my journey into that question started. And there was what I ended up doing is, and this is generally how I work, is I use lots of Post-it notes, and I just had a bunch of Post-it notes, of one color on the wall of all of the conduct that was happening in digital advertising markets. And then as I learned more about financial markets, I started to realize that every single thing that was happening in digital advertising markets that people were complaining about, that was creating competition problems, was identical to conduct that we see in financial markets that's illegal. And then the picture, became very clear that this is what the story is in this market and in advertising. And we probably should have, or I should have, taken a moment first, before diving into this, to discuss how this market works. And so for the layperson, what's really going on is when a user loads a page on the internet through a browser, or they open an app on their mobile phone, in the milliseconds that it takes for that page to load, there's an electronic transaction that's happening on an exchange. So we have a seller, which is like the website owner or the app owner, and then the seller's ad units on that page, the ad space on that page gets routed to exchanges, and there's lots of exchanges. And on those exchanges, there are brokers basically that are competing for those transactions. And within the milliseconds that it takes for the page to load, and you just see the content on the page and the ad on the page, that whole process happens and concludes. That is, the seller routes their ad space to exchanges, brokers compete for it, the highest bidder wins, they return the ad, slot it into the page, and you just see content and sort of have no idea that this happened. But what's really fascinating is that this is likely, the largest electronic trading market now in the world, with billions of transactions happening on these exchanges.
So what is the problem at the moment? I've heard both Senator Warren and Representative Jayapal at various hearings make some statements that seem like they've come right out of your research papers. It sounds like they're almost paraphrased. So you've obviously dug really deep into this whole digital ecosystem. Now, in financial markets, there are all kinds of regulations. You referred to like bad behavior in 2004. Actually, the behavior goes back even further in the 90s when NASDAQ dealers were doing some pretty amazing stuff, like customer orders coming in and they just sort of throw them in the garbage and just ignore them. And they were heavily fined in the 90s. So the financial industry has a rich history of bad behavior and regulators sort of clamping down and saying, can't do that. There's conflict of interest here, or as a broker, you have a fiduciary responsibility to your client. And as an exchange, you've got a responsibility to offer a level playing field to all participants. And all of the regulation in the financial industry has been crafted to ensure that these properties of the marketplace prevail. So what's the problem with digital? You described that you have an exchange in the middle, you have these publishers, let's say on the left-hand side, and you have advertisers on the right-hand side, and they go through these sort of intermediary systems. The advertisers going through sort of ad buying tools and the publishers going through sort of, these inventory management and publishing tools. What's the problem? Because I heard Elizabeth Warren say it's like being a referee and having players in the game. I recall her saying that. So just flesh this out for us. What is the problem with this whole digital advertising marketplace at the moment?
Sure. So let's start with principles we want to uphold in financial markets. So what we know from our experience in financial markets and, basically what every developed country around the world agrees on is that there are two very important things that regulators should maintain in these markets. The one is the management of the conflicts of interest. And the second is transparency. We want a lot of trading transparency to shed light on bad trading behavior. And what I think is also very important, because financial markets are very different and financial exchanges are very particular and they trade a particular type of asset. What's important to note is that we don't just think that these principles should be upheld on financial exchanges, but we've also applied them to other exchanges. So there are more and more sectors of the economy that are migrating to being electronically traded on exchanges. One sector of the economy are airline tickets. And we had lots of similar problems on the centralized reservation systems where airline tickets trade when the industry migrated in the 1970s. That led to regulation. The regulation focused on solving the same problems that we sort of uphold in financial markets, or that we try to regulate in financial markets. We also have ticket exchanges. So when you buy an NFL ticket or a theater ticket to go see a show in New York City, or a music event tickets, also trade on exchanges. And we even have ticket brokers in that market. Now we're dealing with crypto exchanges. And Commissioner Gensler is increasingly wanting to regulate the crypto exchanges in much the same way that we regulate the financial exchanges. So that is to say that we have these principles in financial markets that we apply to financial exchanges, but we've also, applied them to other types of exchanges as well through regulation. And what's happening in advertising markets, again, if we back up, right? So the sort of broad understanding was we have a problem with Google. What's the problem with Google? They're huge. They're dominant. They look like a monopoly. What's going on? And so if you dive into that specific line of thinking, what we're really dealing with is a company that makes almost all of its money selling digital advertising. And within that bucket, money is coming from one of four primary places. The first is selling ads on its own, or ad space on its own properties. This would include things like Google Search and YouTube and maybe Gmail. The second is that Google operates the largest advertising exchange. The third is that Google operates the largest broker representing sellers. And the fourth is that it represents the largest broker representing buyers on those exchanges. And, right off the bat, a big problem here is that Google, as an operator of an exchange, has conflicts of interest. So the company itself has conflicts of interest between these four divisions. And that leads to all of the same type of behavior and trading conduct that we frown upon in financial markets. Things like front running or trading ahead of orders, for example. Things that might be compared to insider trading on inside information. And so it's a problem because we understand these types of markets, these types of exchange markets, and we know what principles should be upheld for the sake of consumer protection and competition. And it also explains why Google is so dominant. Because a lot of these trading behaviors aren't just abusive, they also permit, for example, a broker to corner the exchange market and then the operator of the exchange to corner the buy side. So it's sort of this domino effect that happens in markets, these types of markets, when we don't properly regulate conflicts of interest.
So how did we get here? I mean, this just sounds amazing. Here we have in this country a history of, really careful regulation in the financial space where we've really thought through these issues in great detail and dealt with the behaviors that will arise when perverse incentives exist. Regulators have dealt with this. How do we get here? Is it just because advertising is not a security, that we haven't thought about it as a commodity like we think of in finance? Like, corn, for example, there's a corn futures contract and it involves like a product of some standard quality. Or when you buy a share of IBM is the same for everyone. There's no difference. So there's this notion of sort of a standardized product that's trading on these exchanges and financial markets. Is it the case that we've just had a hard time wrapping our head around advertising as a commodity product? Or is it something else? Or is it the fact that these products are free? So it may be a bunch of things, but I'm just sort of latching on to this for now, this commodity-like nature of financial markets. And maybe one could make the case that, like advertising, it's not really a commodity. It's a one-of-a-kind transaction every time. And so it maybe doesn't really fall under the same umbrella. I'm sort of playing devil's advocate with myself, but I'm just wondering, like, how did we get to this place, given our rich history of regulation in financial markets?
Well, in terms of how we got to this place, one thing that I noticed when I was working in the advertising industry, when I was working for a large company and observing how very large institutional companies operate, I think that the sort of emergence of the internet and the culture in Silicon Valley and engineering and coding and all this kinds of new stuff that is the focus of our economic reality has caught institutions by surprise. And it's very difficult as a large institution to catch up with, from a talent perspective, to even be able to understand what's going on over there. What do you need? How do you get there? And so I keep coming back to this idea that I think there's been a language barrier, but I think that that's just very true, whether it's for large companies in the advertising industry or whether it's for regulatory agencies. And all you have to do is, go read the technical documentation of any of these advertising exchanges. And the average person will be like, whoa, what does this even mean? It's like a different language. And this also shouldn't be a surprise to us because the financial industry has its own language. The crypto industry has its own language. So it's almost like you have to learn the language to stay on top of the industry. In terms of the other sort of reason, the other how we got here, I think that the cardinal sin was approving the Google DoubleClick merger in 2008. This was a moment in time when Google was probably the largest seller of ad space on the internet. And it wanted to get into the business of being the buyer's broker for all these other millions of websites and apps that want to participate in this new electronically traded market. And regulators looked at that, but they didn't look at it with the same lens that's used in financial markets. And so they approved the merger with some, not promises, but sort of statements or promises not to do certain things. So, for example, Google made statements that the data, the trading data belonging to third-party sellers, websites or apps, would belong to them. And, don't worry, we Google cannot do anything with it because that's their data. Ownership rests with them. If we take a step back, that's essentially a promise to not trade on that inside information. Now, in the financial market, we maintain this data structure and these rules through what you brought up before, which is fiduciary duties, right? So the broker can never trade on its client's data because of its fiduciary duty that it owns its clients. Here, we don't have any fiduciary duties in advertising, but there was something similar that was going on. Regulators were a little bit worried about the potential conflicts of interest, and Google said, don't worry, it's not even our data. Ownership rests with the clients, therefore we can never trade on it. Of course, actually, before we get there, so regulators approved the merger, and then, Google proceeded not only to purchase the largest broker that sellers were using, but also now to launch an exchange a year later. And now you have a company that's the largest seller of goods in this market, also operating the largest seller's broker, also operating an exchange, and then also making acquisitions on the buy side. So I think that was probably our greatest mistake. And what I've found so fascinating is lots of people lots of financial regulators some financial regulators have read my work on Google and on advertising. And when they read about that acquisition, there's always a moment where they're like, wow, I can't believe we let that through. I mean, we know that whenever we allow a merger like that, we have to manage conflicts of interest. We never trust them,
Yeah, it was a 4-1 vote, as you point out, that it was approved almost unanimously.
Yeah. So the thinking in financial markets is like irrelevant if somebody makes a promise. There are conflicts of interest. We have to manage the conflicts of interest with ethical walls or through business separations. There's none of this, they're promising not to insider trade. Okay, sure, no problem. We'll allow the merger, right? That framework doesn't even exist. And so I think another thing that's going on that should be top of mind for us as a country is we probably just need the left hand to talk more to the right hand in these types of situations. This is a market that looks very similar to financial markets. Regulators should have leaned on the expertise of regulators in financial markets.
Given that we had that original sin, one would have expected that the conditions to that would have been, okay, you can't operate an exchange in the future. If we allow this, then by definition, that would create a conflict of interest. So they should have actually prohibited them from entering markets that would lead to conflicts of interest.
Absolutely. Right. So the key there is to either prohibit going into business lines that would create conflicts of interest, or at minimum, to require the businesses to manage conflicts of interest through things like, okay, employees of your exchange need to be on this floor. They can't go down to the broker floor. They can't talk to each other. You can't merge data between divisions. The broker on the 7th floor can't trade on data from the 9th floor. Those kinds of things.
So to what extent is quote unquote free been the problem here for regulators, right? Because
not at all.
Because one of the standard lenses for regulators is it leading to higher prices? And you say, well, it's a free product. It's not leading to higher prices. So, has that been a distraction? The fact that these products are quote unquote free to the end user, even though they may be anything but free to the marketplace as a whole. I think one of the arguments you make is that it's actually leading to a marketplace that is less efficient. To what extent has free been the culprit here or a distraction?
So not at all. Free has not been a distraction in this market. Let me give one data point in this regard. So we used to live in a world of Mad Men, now we don't need to take meetings, and we have billions of electronic transactions happening in milliseconds on these new advertising exchanges. This migration to electronic trading should make this industry more efficient, right? But in advertising, we're dealing in a world where an advertising exchange takes a double-digit cut on anything that clears on its exchange. So if you're a website like the New York Times, let's say, and you sell a transaction or transactions on an exchange, and the value of those transactions is $100,000, you're giving, double digits of that transaction to the exchange operator just for the privilege of executing that trade on the exchange. That's crazy. That's really high.
Wow. Compare that to financial markets where the transaction costs are a few basis points of the value of the transaction as a whole.
Right. And all the exchange is doing is just doing an electronic match between a buy and a sell. That's it. I mean, the exchange is just dumb pipes.
So, when you describe it like this just seems incredible, right? That we have the situation, the biggest market in the world, dominated by a company that runs the marketplace and is a broker on both sides of the transaction. And it just seems so obvious and incredible in retrospect. So what's the solution? Why are lawmakers still struggling in terms of what to do about this? Is this just because some people, one of my colleagues actually argues that these platforms are in principle more powerful than the government. They've got legal staffs that are, many times the size that, what the SEC or the CFTC has. Is it just that they have so much muscle at this point and just so strong that it's just difficult to do anything? Why are we in this paralysis? Or are we? Do you expect some significant changes going forward? What should we expect to see? Lots of questions there. I'm sorry, I just threw in maybe 4 questions, but take them in any order.
That's okay. I try to focus on my research and not think about these types of questions too much. I think there's a problem of political gridlock that goes beyond these issues. That's probably one of the things that just is slowing things down, right?
By political gridlock, you mean it's a partisan thing?
Yeah, and I don't even think it's very partisan. I don't think it is partisan on these issues. I think it's incredibly nonpartisan. We've seen the left and the right come together and hold hands on these issues, which is amazing, right? So the Texas Attorney General is leading the charge in the antitrust case against Google, and I'm working on that case. And yet, we had Senator Warren come out and sort of complain and talk about the same issues. So I think it's been incredibly bipartisan. But your question was sort of taking that a step further and sort of why can't we pass laws faster? And I think that's an entirely different ballgame.
Even before we get to pass laws faster, I guess my question is, what should those laws be? Given that we know what the problem is, right? There are obvious conflicts of interest that will not go away. If anything, they'll just get worse. Is the solution then to say, well, let's borrow a page from financial services and make sure that we apply the same kind of framework to manage conflicts of interest? That doesn't seem like rocket science. So where's the gridlock? What's the reason for this gridlock? If we know what the problem is.
Yeah, I don't know if there would be gridlock on the solution, and the reason is because, are you going to have senators disagree that there shouldn't be insider trading in this market? I mean, that's a very difficult position. So it's a very difficult position to take. It's also very difficult because financial regulations is one of the sort of pride and joys of the United States, and we take a lot of ownership over the regulatory structure in that market, and we take a leadership position internationally in helping other countries understand how to regulate these markets. We have a lot of history here. So what are we doing to our own leadership position, with regards to this type of thinking, if we say, oh, but we're going to just let the advertising markets run wild and free, right? So I don't imagine that there would be gridlock on the direction of the solution. I think where people might start to split hairs is around, okay, well, we all agree we should manage conflicts of interest. Now let's have a conversation about how we should do that. And there you might have some people say, well, we should just prohibit Google from operating a broker and operating an exchange at the same time. There should be just an absolute black and white rule. You can't do both. Therefore, you got to divest these business divisions that have conflicts of interest. And on the other side, you're going to have folks say, no, it's okay. They can own both. Let's just, require them to manage their conflicts. Let's have ethical walls, but that's going to require ongoing oversight. Promise not to do X, Y, and Z. And so I think that's sort of the spectrum of where disagreement will fall. But at a big picture level, I think with it that we inevitably have to agree, and it has to be not controversial, that we need to, A, manage conflicts of interest in this trading environment, and 2, we need to uphold principles of transparency. So it is often the case, on the second point of transparency, in the advertising industry, that you as a seller, if you sell your goods on an exchange, you have no idea what the buyer actually paid for it. And so, there could be a few simple rules that just shed light on margins and take rates and prices and what people are paying and where's the money going that will just help the market become more efficient.
That was really well put, Dina, about where the disagreements might lie regarding breaking up big tech versus managing their conflicts of interest better. And good point about the benefits of transparency in making ad markets more efficient, not unlike what we went through in financial markets. So let's broaden this discussion and consider what problems are common and run across other big tech companies like Facebook versus what's unique to Google and Facebook.
If you just read sort of Facebook and Google's SEC filings, you'll note that both of these companies make almost all of their money selling online advertising. And they're different in that sort of Facebook is selling ads on its social network. And for consumers understand Facebook as a social network. They understand Instagram as a social network. They understand WhatsApp as a messaging app. And I'll just pause here and note that Facebook, like Google, also operates an electronic trading marketplace, which many people don't know, but it's also doing that. So Facebook isn't just selling its own ad space, it's also operating this marketplace that trades the inventory of third parties. And that's a conflict of, same conflict of interest problem. What is similar? The one thing that is similar from a very big picture standpoint is how the companies say one thing and do another when it comes to consumers' privacy. These two things are related. So let me just stop here for a minute. So if we look at prices on advertising exchanges, the sort of single variable that causes prices to fluctuate is the existence of user data and transactions. So if you're a buyer or seller and you know who the user that's viewing ad space is, prices can double or drop by half. If you don't have that piece of information, you're at the losing end of those trades. And so at a very big picture level, Google and Facebook are two companies that make almost all of their money selling online ads, and they are desperately hungry for data for their trading operations. They need consumer data. And this puts them in a pickle because we're a democracy, we have the Fourth Amendment, we're not really down with this surveillance stuff, we like our privacy. And so how do these companies fulfill their insatiable appetite for more and more consumer data? And eventually, one of the ways that they do this is through deceptive means or hiding privacy permissions or deceptive UI UX patterns, these dark patterns and things like that.
Talking about data and what it's used for, one of my previous guests, Brian Christian, informed me about the fact that on mobile devices, Facebook has replaced its algorithm for maximizing clicks. They've replaced it with a reinforcement learning algorithm aimed to maximize total engagement. That is, induce people to come back to the platform for more dopamine hits, which reminds me of the cigarette industry and its attempt to create addiction and sell more cigarettes. Do you see a parallel, or have I gone into Twilight Zone here?
No, it's good. I mean, look, these aren't evil plans. They are money plans. And this should not be a surprise. I mean, these are corporations. Their charter is to make money and make more money. Well, what kind of company are we dealing with? We're dealing with a company that makes money by selling ad space. There's two ways you increase revenue the next quarter and the quarter after that. One is through selling more ad space, and the other is through increasing the profitability of the transaction when you sell the ad space. And for the first thing, selling more ad space, well, where do you get ad space from? We don't pull it out of thin air. In order to have more ad space to sell, we need more clicks, more engagement, more whatever, because ad space is sold on a click basis, but also on an engagement basis. So we just need more stuff to sell. And how do we generate more ad space to sell? Well, you need more people to stay on your site longer, to come back more often, to click more, right? So this is where that whole addiction cycle comes in. They need to generate the ad space in the first place. And if you use Facebook or Facebook properties for 15 minutes a day, that's going to give you X volume of ad space to sell. But if you use Facebook and Instagram, I think it's up to now 2 hours a day or 2+ hours a day for the average American consumer. Well, now you have a lot more inventory and volume to sell, and that's going to affect the money, right? So this is the money plan. In the second bucket, you need more user data. And actually more user data is also for the first bucket, because if you know more about me, then you'll be able to figure out what you got to do to get me to come back more, and that generates more ad space. And in the second bucket, you need user data to be able to, because again, all those ads are traded in real time electronically, and you need data to inform smart trading decisions. And so there too, data is relevant.
Slightly tangential question. To what extent are we dealing with winner-take-all tendencies of digital platforms, and therefore this tendency towards monopolies, towards sort of natural monopolies? Are monopolies inevitable in this ecosystem?
Yeah, no, absolutely not. Absolutely not. I mean, look, if we allowed Citadel to do whatever it wanted, market would probably tip in Citadel's lap, right? Or the New York Stock Exchange. Probably not the New York Stock Exchange anymore, but you know what I'm saying. So I think that we've got two distinct problems that we're looking at. One, and this was our Google conversation, you have another sector of the US economy and of the global economy that has migrated to electronic trading on centralized exchanges. The structure of the market is also parallel. You've got brokers representing sellers, brokers representing buyers, and exchanges that are competing for transactions. And in order to foster competition and to protect competition in these types of markets, we need to make sure that we regulate conflicts of interest and promote transparency and stop things like insider trading and front running of orders and problems of adverse selection trades and stuff like that. The second problem that we're dealing with as a society is one where it's almost like a cigarette problem. There are externalities in this market. So we have to ask questions as a society like, I don't know, is it great that we have these businesses that get consumers hooked, and now consumers are spending 2 hours a day on social media or on gaming? Do we like that from a productivity basis? Do we want that for our society? Do we think that's good? Is it really innocuous? Are there a list of bad things associated with that we don't want in our society? And then maybe we have to regulate that in some way, shape, or fashion.
That second problem is a hard one to solve in a free society, isn't it? About the harm to consumers.
Perhaps. I think that, and I'm not an expert on this topic by any means.
I'm not either. I'm just wondering whether that's getting in the way.
So it's possible. It's possible. I think it's also possible that if we were to dive into this rabbit hole, right, this second topic, we might have the confidence to take to have very clear opinions on things. Like, for example, we know that this is not just kind of a problem or maybe a problem, but it is a black and white problem in the following 4 respects, and this is how it's harming consumers, right? And so I think we need to get there. I don't think we're there yet in terms of our understanding of the effects of these types of business models. And then after that, I don't know. Do we live in a country where these things are difficult? I moved from Connecticut to California, and like we couldn't buy alcohol after a certain time in the evening, and we couldn't buy alcohol on Sundays. And I feel like we live in, actually, the United States is very hands-on in these different types of markets, right? But it takes time to get there. Look how much time it took for us to understand cigarettes and the effect of cigarettes.
True. I'm an optimist, so I guess what you're really saying is, we'll solve this. It just takes time.
I do think so. Yes, I think it is that type of a problem.
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's good to know. So, what can we learn from the other parts of the world when it comes to the governance of these platforms? I broadly characterize sort of the world, grossly oversimplifying as sort of the US model. Then you have Europe and China and India, sort of different ways of thinking about the internet and governance of platforms. Is there anything that US lawmakers can learn from how other parts of the world are thinking about these issues?
There was one thing I would hope the US could learn right now or from other parts of the world. It would probably be the speed with which China is taking action in some of these markets. Just speed, I think that in America, we're going to spend way too much time outside of electronically traded ads, maybe. We're going to spend way too much time debating and thinking about, well, is it bad? Is it kind of good? Do we want to regulate it? Maybe it's okay that it's kind of bad. Maybe we shouldn't touch it, all this kinds of stuff. And we'll get there eventually. But it'll take us a lot of time. And I've just been watching China over the last 6 months. And again, I'm not an expert here. But just the speed with which they take action is just fascinating.
I guess there's 2 sides to that, right? Which is that they can take action instantly because they don't need to discuss it and have the kinds of processes we have. So I agree with you. It's sort of a double-edged sword. On the one hand, I sort of appreciate our model of discussion and debate and all of that. But the other hand, I do find it frustrating at the speed at which we're acting and how long it's taken us to get our head around this problem. I mean, it just seems like when I think of the hearings in 2018, where we had no idea, or at least lawmakers had no idea what the problem was. I think they've come a long way in the last 3 years, but it's, I agree. It's been a very slow kind of process.
I mean, the other thing, though, is I would say is, yes, completely double-edged sword. It's good to be thoughtful about these issues. But what I sort of worry about is that, we're often going to be in situations where if you were to sort of take the temperature of the US populace, the entire country, maybe through a phone text message, right? That you would have overwhelming understanding and support for Proposition A. Let's take steps to reduce social media addiction for children in the following age groups. For example, let's just say it's that, right? Mm-hmm. But on Capitol Hill, we're going to engage because of lobbying power or whatnot for a much longer period of time in this sort of fake dialogue that does not represent the sentiment of the people. And that's what I worry about.
I do realize that we never said anything about the other big tech companies, specifically Amazon and Apple. Microsoft seems to be off the hot seat these days. Do they also have similar conflicts of interest in terms of sort of running the marketplace and being a participant?
Great question. I think we see similar problems, for example, with Amazon, these conflicts of interest issues. But what's really interesting also with Amazon, for example, just to take it back to the financial markets analogy and what we know about these types of markets and the management of conflicts of interest. With Amazon, we had a situation where their CEO, Jeff Bezos, was dragged before a hearing in Washington and testified that it was something like, I forget, because this was a while ago and I haven't thought about this for a while, but he said something like Amazon employees don't use the data belonging to independent third-party sellers to inform how they create and sell their own products in the same market, right, on the Amazon marketplace.
Yes, I remember that.
This is, again, similar to a promise to not trade on inside information. That's their data. Yes, we have conflicts of interest. Don't worry, when we're making decisions about selling our stuff, we're not peeking at their data over there, right? So it's a similar conflicts of interest, don't use their data separations, insider trading kind of concept going on, right? And then the Wall Street Journal released this fantastic piece of investigative journalism where they discovered that actually that's exactly what Amazon employees are doing, right? Mm-hmm. And so what we ought to know about these types of problems is that it is irrelevant that Bezos testified X. It is irrelevant if the company actually wants to make sure and actually has a policy that employees not use third-party data. Because what we know to be true is that when you have a company that has conflicts of interest and where trading decisions, where data is highly valuable to trading decisions, employees will inevitably break rules, right? Even if the company has the rules, to do just that. And so it's not enough if I were advising a company and they said, oh, well, you know what? We have conflicts of interest. We have this rule. We tell our employees, we train them that they can't use third-party data when they're selling their own stuff or making decisions about their own selling strategy. I would advise, well, that's great. But are they on different floors? Do they have access to the same data sets? You know? Do you have structural separations between the databases to make sure that these employees are not using that or don't have access to that data? Because those are the types of steps that you need to have in place as a company to make sure that employees actually abide by these sorts of concepts and rules. So that's sort of one thing that I think about when I think about Amazon. When it comes to Apple, I think the App Store debate is fascinating. One of the reasons why I think it's fascinating is but I understand when in the early days of the browsers themselves were also thinking about instituting a payment layer into the browser. Would we today be sitting around having an antitrust debate about, if we had sort of a browser market that was oligopolistic, and you had two major browsers, and each of those browsers forced a certain percentage of e-commerce transactions to go through the browser's payment layer where they took 15-30%. Would we be having this conversation? It seems like really not controversial. But, in the App Store world, we're having this, vigorous debate about, well, it's okay because it's, Apple and it's the App Store and it's justified that there's a 15 to 30% tax on some e-commerce transactions. So I think that's like super fascinating. I also think that it's really difficult to get these things right as a regulator, right? So once you decide you're going to be more hands-on, this might be a super obvious one that we want to, step in on. But I think it's just really hard to get these types of things right on an ongoing basis. So you just have error risk.
The whole App Store thing is another conversation in itself. Why doesn't Adobe run an App Store? What's to prevent other people from running App Stores? That in itself is something that most people really don't think about. Why App Store is run by Google and Amazon, as opposed to other players. Well, Dina, thank you for joining us and sharing your expertise with the rest of the world. I'm actually encouraged talking to you. You pointed out those two problems, but I think at least the first of those two seems like it's addressable, and it should be a question of when as opposed to if it's addressed.
I do think so. I hope so.
Yeah, I hope so too. because I think business as usual is probably not going to get us to a good place.
Yep, I agree.
All right. Well, thanks again for being on the show. Really appreciated the conversation.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for having me. It's been my pleasure.
Take care. Thank you.
Bye-bye.